Amid the fiery WrestleMania, fireworks tearing apart the night sky like endless showers of light that never fade, tens of thousands of people stood up at once, roaring a name that had transcended the boundaries of wrestling to become an icon of an entire era: Shawn Michaels. Over many decades, he was not just a champion, but the soul of WWE's biggest nights, the man who turned WrestleMania into a sanctuary and himself into an unmatched standard that no one could surpass. Mr. WrestleMania was not a title randomly bestowed by the media, but one built through classic matches, breathtaking moments, rises after seemingly unbearable pain, and the ability to silence an entire arena with just a glance. Shawn Michaels was the first Grand Slam champion, the winner of the Royal Rumble from the #1 position, the one always entrusted with carrying the audience's faith in the most critical moments. On the mat, he was the perfect blend of technique, emotion, and performative instinct, an artist who used his body to tell stories that millions believed in and revered. Every victory, every applause, every chant of his name further solidified the legend that Shawn Michaels was born to stand under the lights, to win, to become irreplaceable. But just as that spotlight reached its peak, another truth quietly existed behind the dazzling mask. When the backstage doors closed and the lights gradually dimmed, Shawn Michaels sat alone in the empty locker room, hands still wrapped in sweat-soaked tape, body aching, and mind heavy, not celebrating, unseen by anyone, left only with a silence that stretched on until it became suffocating. In those moments, he understood that he had lived two parallel lives for many years. One man, fueled by cheers, titles, and admiration, and another living in fear, addiction, emptiness, always anxious that if the world knew the real person behind the mask, everything would collapse. The thought, if they knew the real me, would they still cheer, haunted him endlessly, like a deep cut that never healed. But within that pain, a resilient will still endured, the will of a man accustomed to rising after every fall, not just in the ring, but in his own life. Living two lives was not a choice, but the way Shawn Michaels survived, endured, and kept moving forward, carrying all the cracks until one day he could learn to face himself without needing the lights for protection. If you want to continue diving deeper into the story behind the glamour, where the cracks and the will of Shawn Michaels gradually come to light, please subscribe so you don't miss the next part of this journey. Thank you for joining, and see you in the next part, where the truth about that double life begins to be told more fully. Shawn Michaels gradually became the perfect image that WWE wanted the world to see. On every poster, every promotional video, every WrestleMania night, he appeared as the embodiment of greatness, confident, captivating, coldly precise in every movement. No one told WWE's big story without mentioning him. No one defined a classic match without using Shawn Michaels as the benchmark. Mr. WrestleMania was not a nickname created for flattery, but the result of dozens of big nights where he carried on his shoulders the entire expectations of the audience, the company, and an entire era. When they needed someone who could step out under the heaviest pressure and turn it into art, WWE always chose Shawn, and he rarely let them down. But that very perfection was built on something no one clearly saw: loneliness that stretched on year after year. Shawn Michaels had no true close friends in the wrestling world he dominated. Backstage, where it should have been a place to relax after the performance, instead became a space of distance and caution. The ego grown alongside fame made it hard for him to trust anyone, and the fear of being replaced kept everyone at a safe distance. He was used to being loved by tens of thousands at once, but didn't know how to lean on one single person when everything became too heavy. Shawn had no true mental refuge, no space to remove the mask he was forced to wear every time he stepped onto the stage. Wrestling gradually became the absolute center of his life. It was the only home where Shawn felt he belonged, where he was recognized, honored, seen most clearly. In that world, every rule was familiar, every reaction controllable, and he knew exactly what to do to survive and win. But that very home, over time, turned into an invisible prison. Every match was not just a performance, but a time when Shawn had to prove he was still worthy, still at the top, still irreplaceable. He didn't allow himself weakness because an icon wasn't permitted to break in front of the public. He didn't allow himself to slow down because just one moment of loosening and the world would immediately find someone else to place their faith in. In WWE, Shawn Michaels was always at the center of the light, but because of that, he was very far from everyone else. Backstage conversations rarely reached him in a real way. He was present, but didn't belong. The laughter, the pats on the back, the celebration parties after matches only skimmed the surface, never delving into the emptiness inside. When the familiar music played and he stepped out into the sea of people, Shawn Michaels donned the image of an invincible man, someone who needed no one, no comfort or empathy. But deep inside, the emptiness kept growing, like a windowless room with no escape. Wrestling gave him everything a wrestler could dream of: titles, money, power, immortality in fans' memories. But it also took away many other things, quieter but no less important: the feeling of being himself, of being weak, of being wrong, of leaning on someone without fear of losing his position. Shawn Michaels loved wrestling so much, he couldn't imagine life without it, and that very love bound him tighter each year. WrestleMania nights ended in glory, but afterward came long hallways, empty locker rooms, and the feeling that no one was truly waiting for him out there, not as a legend, but as a human needing understanding. WWE gave Shawn Michaels a grand stage, but couldn't give him a place to hide from that stage itself. And so, the glory continued to build higher, layer by layer, while the loneliness grew with the years, quietly becoming the price Shawn Michaels accepted to pay, to hold on to his position as a living legend. Shawn Michaels' childhood had no fixed point to return to. No familiar street, no backyard to remember, no group of friends growing up together year after year. His family was tied to the military, and that meant cardboard boxes never fully unpacked, endless drives across states, houses with just enough time to hang a few photos before taking them down again. While other kids learned to call one place home, Shawn learned to pack up. While others built friendships over years, Shawn learned to say goodbye. Each move left behind a layer of familiarity just starting to form, carrying with it the feeling that nothing was permanent. No one truly stayed. In that world, Shawn wasn't taught that things would be stable, but that everything could disappear at any moment. Gradually, he learned not to place too deep trust in anyone, because trust always came with loss. He learned to keep distance, to keep an escape route for himself, always ready to leave before being left behind. That wasn't intentional coldness, but the survival reflex of a child uprooted again before taking root. In new classrooms, Shawn was often the latecomer, the one who had to quickly learn to fit in and then learn even faster to leave. He had no time to become indispensable to anyone, nor did he expect anyone to become indispensable to him. Every acquaintance, every closeness, carried a silent reminder that it would all end. In that instability, the fear of abandonment began to form, quiet and persistent. Shawn didn't say it, but he felt clearly that this world didn't stand still waiting for him, and if he didn't hold his own position, he would be replaced, forgotten, left behind, like the old houses he'd lived in. From very early on, Shawn developed a strong need for control, not out of power hunger, but because control was the only way to feel safe. If everything was within reach, if he knew what would happen, then leaving wouldn't be a surprise, and the pain would be lessened. But life didn't work that way, and each time he lost control, the insecurity in Shawn grew a little more. He began compensating by expressing himself, by standing out, by not allowing himself to fade in any space. If he couldn't take root, at least he had to be seen. If he couldn't stay long, he had to leave a mark. That childhood had no specific tragedy to name, no clear breaking moment, but the very lack of stability was the deepest crack. It taught Shawn that no place was completely safe, that people would eventually leave, that it was best to rely only on himself. As he grew up, those lessons didn't disappear, but only changed form. They followed him into the wrestling world, where every relationship was tied to benefit, where today's position didn't guarantee tomorrow's, where the lights could go out any time. The childhood fear of abandonment transformed into the need to always be at the top, to always control the narrative, to always be the one chosen. And from here, the seeds of the double life began to sprout. On the outside, Shawn Michaels learned to become strong, confident, carefree, as if nothing could touch him. But inside, that rootless boy still existed, always vigilant, always preparing for the day he'd have to leave once more. A childhood without roots didn't make Shawn weak in an obvious way, but it left him never truly at ease, never fully believing he was kept for who he really was. And when he stepped into WWE's lights, carrying all those unhealed cracks, no one realized that the future legend was being built on the foundation of a child accustomed to living in a state of readiness to leave, readiness for loss, and always fearing that one day, even the lights would turn their back on him. After years of constant moving, when every house was only temporary and every relationship came with a built-in end date, Shawn Michaels, for the first time, found a place that didn't require him to explain who he was. It wasn't school, it wasn't a neighborhood, and it wasn't a new family. It was the wrestling gym, a rough space filled with the mixed smell of sweat and metal, where bodies collided without needing introductions, where a person's worth wasn't about where they came from, but whether they could stay on their feet. For Shawn Michaels, that gym became the first refuge in his life, a place where he didn't have to prepare to leave from the very start. There, no one asked how many places he'd lived, how many friends he'd lost, or where he was headed next. They only watched how he trained, how he fell, and how he got back up. And for the first time, Shawn felt something he'd never had before: recognition. Not pity, not curiosity, but acknowledgement that he had value, that his body and will were strong enough to exist in this space. Every training session was an affirmation. Every bruise, every ache, was proof that he was moving forward, that there was a place in the world that needed him. Wrestling gave Shawn a structure his childhood had never provided. It had rules, order, clear goals. If he trained hard enough, endured enough pain, he would be seen. If he got up after every fall, he would be kept. In a life full of sudden goodbyes, wrestling offered a rare sense of stability. There, Shawn was no longer the kid always ready to pack up. He was an apprentice, a warrior being forged, a person gradually forming an identity. But within that comfort, another seed quietly began to sprout. Shawn started tying his entire sense of security to wrestling. When he trained well, he felt he existed. When he was praised, he felt worthy. When he progressed faster than others, he believed he'd finally found where he belonged. Wrestling wasn't just a career path. It became the sole pillar holding up his sense of self. Little by little, Shawn learned to measure his worth by the gym's reactions, by the coach's glances, by whether his name was still called. And in a soul accustomed to being left behind, that recognition carried the weight of survival. Without wrestling, he didn't know who he was. Without the gym, he didn't know where he belonged. This dependence didn't come from fame, ambition, but from fear of emptiness. Wrestling filled the void left by childhood, but it also made Shawn fear losing it more than anything else. He trained as if it were the only way to survive, pushing his body beyond limits, not just to get better, but to ensure he remained necessary. Each time he fell harder, he got up faster. because deep down, Shawn believed that if he paused even for a moment, everything would vanish like the old houses he'd lived in. The gym became where he escaped the fear of abandonment, but also where he learned that his value always had to be proven continuously. No wrestling, no self. That thought rooted so deeply that Shawn could no longer distinguish where his real self ended and the role he was playing began. Wrestling saved Shawn from feeling lost, but it also laid the foundation for a life where he would tie himself tightly to the lights, to recognition, to always having to be present. In that moment, when Shawn Michaels found the first lifeline of his life, he didn't know he was also tying the first knot in a dependence that would last decades, where his existence would always be linked to being seen, being called, and being kept in a world that never stands still. When Shawn Michaels stepped deeper into the world of professional wrestling, he was no longer completely alone like in his early gym days. For the first time in a long while, he had someone standing beside him long enough to call family. Marty Jannetty wasn't just a tag team partner. He was the one sharing long drives, cramped locker rooms, hurried meals after shows, and the unfinished dreams of two young guys who believed wrestling could give them everything. In the Rockers, Shawn no longer had to prove himself every day in isolation. With Marty there, he felt he belonged to something, a bond not based on power or hierarchy, but on companionship. They complemented each other, relied on each other, laughed together, hurt together, and believed that if one fell, the other would pull him up. For Shawn, that feeling was so rare that he clung to it like a lifeline. After a rootless childhood and years of relying only on himself, Marty became the first person to make Shawn believe he could stay, that not every relationship ended in parting. But the wrestling world isn't a place that nurtures innocence. Behind the applause for the Rockers was a harsh reality. Individual success always took priority over feelings, and every story needed someone to leave so another could rise. When the decision to split the Rockers came, it wasn't just a career turning point. It was a direct blow to how Shawn saw the world. The on-screen betrayal, the moment Shawn turned his back on Marty, pushed him through glass, and left a shocking image for the audience, was scripted as a dramatic explosion. To viewers, it was a memorable segment. To Shawn, it formalized a deep fear that every relationship, no matter how close, could be sacrificed when opportunity arose. Even knowing it was a storyline, a necessary act for the narrative, that sense of betrayal didn't stay on stage. It seeped into Shawn's mind, blending with old memories of having to leave, say goodbye, protect himself before being left behind. From that moment, Shawn learned a brutal lesson he'd carry for years. Feelings always have a price, and that price is sometimes loneliness. He began viewing every relationship through a lens of caution. If even someone considered family could be traded for advancement, who was truly safe? The breakup of the Rockers not only freed Shawn for a brilliant solo path, but also reinforced a cold belief in him that to survive at the top, he couldn't attach too deeply. From then on, Shawn gradually closed off his softest part. He learned to keep people at just enough distance to avoid hurt when parting came. He learned to put career above emotion, because emotion, from his experience, always came with loss. Marty Jannetty became a memory both warm and painful, reminding Shawn that there was once a time he believed in unconditional friendship, and that very belief had hurt him deeply. That event didn't turn Shawn ruthless overnight, but it planted a seed of doubt. Every new relationship, whether friend or colleague, Shawn always kept an escape route. He was ready to leave before being left, ready to push others away before they could do it to him. Under the bright lights, Shawn Michaels began building the image of a carefree guy, someone who needed no one, as if proud of his ability to stand alone. But deep inside, it was just a shell formed from fear of being hurt again. The Rockers had once given Shawn a sense of belonging, and their breakup taught him that belonging was a luxury in a world where everything could be traded. That lesson followed him to the heights of fame, weaving into every decision, every relationship, every moment he chose to put himself first. And while audiences saw a Shawn Michaels growing sharper, bolder, willing to do anything to win, very few realized that behind that determination was the child from years ago who had learned to survive by never fully trusting anyone again. The breakup of the Rockers not only opened a new path in his career, but also marked the moment a different person began to form. Shawn Michaels stepped into the lights with a new persona, sharper, bolder, and more dangerous. HBK, the Heartbreak Kid. That character didn't ask permission to exist. He was arrogant, carefree, ready to provoke the whole world, as if no limits applied to him. In the ring, HBK didn't just compete, he dominated. Every step, every gesture, every look was calculated to declare that this was his stage, and everyone else was just background. HBK's confidence wasn't ordinary. It was challenging, sarcastic, like a statement that he didn't need anyone's approval. Fans loved and hated the character, but couldn't look away. And that was exactly what Shawn Michaels needed then. To be seen, noticed, affirmed that he couldn't be ignored. But behind that arrogant shell, another reality quietly existed. Offstage, Shawn Michaels bore no resemblance to the carefree guy on the show. When the lights went out, the confidence crumbled away in pieces, revealing an insecure person always doubting himself and fearing that it was all temporary. HBK's inflated ego wasn't a sign of stability, but a hastily sewn armor to hide the fear of being replaced, forgotten, deemed unnecessary. Shawn had learned early that in this world, if he didn't push himself forward, no one would do it for him. And so he pushed, harder and farther, until the gap between the character and the real person became clear. On stage, HBK shone like someone who knew no fear. Off stage, Shawn Michaels began carrying a self-loathing, a hard-to-name but persistent emotion. He looked in the mirror and saw someone the world worshipped, but wasn't sure he deserved it. Every praise seemed to need reproving in the next match. Every success carried worry that he wouldn't pull it off next time. Those two people, HBK and Shawn, gradually separated like parallel lines. One lived on arrogance, the other on doubt. And to keep HBK alive, Shawn paid the price by burying his real feelings deep. He didn't allow himself weakness, because weakness was something the HBK character could never show. He didn't allow himself to admit fear, because fear would shatter the image he'd worked hard to build. Instead, Shawn poured everything into maintaining the act, letting HBK grow stronger, bolder, more undeniable. But each time the character was pushed higher, the real person behind was left deeper in the shadows. Shawn Michaels began living in constant tension, as if loosening for a second would make everything collapse. He didn't believe he was loved for his real self, only for the character he portrayed, and that belief made him grow farther from himself. HBK became what Shawn relied on to exist, but also what disoriented him. When not in the ring, Shawn didn't know who to be. Without donning the arrogance, he felt exposed and vulnerable. The self-loathing sprang from that void, from feeling his real self wasn't strong enough to stand without the mask. The relationships around Shawn were gradually affected too. He was hard to approach, quick to anger, and often pushed others away before they could get close. Not because he didn't need anyone, but because he feared that if someone saw the real person behind HBK, they would leave. The HBK character thus became both shield and wall. It protected Shawn from fear of hurt, but also blocked him from real connections with others. In those years, Shawn Michaels lived like two different people in one body. One worshipped by millions, always confident and ready to challenge the world. The other waking each day with insecurity, wondering if he was fooling everyone. That separation didn't happen suddenly, but slowly, day by day, match by match. Each time the music played, and the HBK character stepped out to take the stage. And while the world saw a Shawn Michaels growing stronger, more irreplaceable, very few realized he was gradually losing the ability to live true to himself. HBK was born as an icon, but also as the first sign of a long inner conflict, where the ego inflated to hide fear, and where the real person quietly retreated, making way for a legend built from both talent and unhealed cracks. The peak of fame came to Shawn Michaels so fast and fiercely that he didn't even realize he had stepped into a different life. Titles followed one after another, power grew with every entrance music cue, and the crowd rising to cheer. In WWE, he wasn't just a champion. He was the center of major decisions, the one trusted to carry the most important nights. Doors opened for Shawn in every direction. Money, influence, favoritism, the feeling that he was irreplaceable. On the surface, it was any wrestler's dream. But beneath that layer of glamour, a different rhythm of life began to form, quiet and dangerous. The pain after matches no longer stayed at an acceptable level. Painkillers appeared as a temporary solution, then quickly became a habit. Alcohol came afterward, not to celebrate victories, but to silence the noises in his head, to help Shawn sleep, or at least forget that he couldn't sleep. Sleepless nights stretched on, where the body was exhausted, but the mind stayed taut like a string, becoming a normal part of life. Shawn stepped out on stage in a state where even he wasn't sure where he stood between alertness and depletion. And the scariest part was that he still performed well, still got cheered, still completed the role perfectly. That very smoothness made every boundary start to blur. When everything on the outside said he was at the top, Shawn had no reason to stop and ask what price he was paying. The HBK character grew bigger, sharper, and took up more and more space, while the real person behind it grew tired, chaotic, and gradually accustomed to relying on things that helped him get through the night. Pills to handle pain, alcohol to shut off thoughts, and the lights to remind him he still had value. That was the loop starting to form. The more success, the greater the pressure. The greater the pressure, the stronger the need to escape. Shawn no longer knew when he was performing and when he was living. When the audience saw an arrogant, carefree HBK, confident enough to challenge the whole world, they believed that was the real him. And Shawn started to believe it too, or at least forced himself to believe it, because without that role, he didn't know what he had left. The relationships around him grew more strained. The unpredictability, the bursts of anger, the impulsive decisions gradually became part of Shawn's backstage image. But even that was justified by fame. He could get away with it, because he was Shawn Michaels. That invisible favoritism unintentionally fed the growing double life. By day, a legend. By night, a man who couldn't sleep without something to numb the feeling. By day, controlling the entire arena. By night, losing control of himself. Shawn began living in a prolonged state of detachment, where he observed himself from the outside as if watching another character run his life for him. Rare, quiet moments no longer brought peace, but only made the insecurity clearer. When there were no cheers, Shawn faced the emptiness that pills and alcohol only temporarily covered. And the next morning, the loop started again, stronger, deeper. Titles kept coming, power kept expanding, and the double life kept digging in. No one forced Shawn to live like that, but no one showed him how to stop when the whole world was still applauding. The danger of peak fame wasn't that it changed a person, but that it allowed a person to delay facing themselves. For Shawn Michaels, that peak became the perfect shell for a life cracking from the inside. He went through each big night with the familiar smile, each match with undeniable confidence, while deep down, the question grew more blurred. Am I ultimately playing HBK to live, or living just to keep playing HBK? And when that question no longer had a clear answer, Shawn Michaels' double life officially began. Not loudly, not announced, but persistent and enduring, like a shadow stretching behind the dazzling lights. Backstage, the place the audience never sees, gradually became Shawn Michaels' own private hell. After every match, when his body was still hot from impacts and joints sent undeniable pain signals, painkillers appeared as an inevitable part of the ritual ending the night. At first, just to keep competing, to step out the next day as if nothing had happened. But very quickly, it was no longer just for healing pain. It became the only way Shawn felt he could exist in a body gradually betraying him. Physical pain blended with mental fatigue, creating constant pressure that was never released. When pills were no longer strong enough to calm the mind, alcohol stepped in, quietly but surely. Alcohol didn't come to celebrate wins or share joy with colleagues, but to help Shawn sleep, or at least make him forget he couldn't sleep. Long nights in unfamiliar hotels, where the hum of the air conditioner and dim yellow lights were the only things filling the space, Shawn lay there, staring at a familiar ceiling that never brought safety. He drank to turn off thoughts, to stop the repeating questions in his head. Where am I going? What do I have left besides the stage? And if the lights go out forever, who am I? The higher he rose, the more isolated Shawn became. Backstage was no longer a place to share or unwind, but an underground battlefield of egos, power, and suspicion. He clearly felt the looks from those around him, admiring yet wary. No one really got close, and Shawn didn't allow anyone too close either. Every relationship carried the potential for betrayal. Every word could become a knife in the back. And so, Shawn withdrew into himself, building invisible walls around him. He was present in the crowd, but always alone. That isolation wasn't an unexpected consequence, but the result of years protecting himself by pushing others away. But the more isolated, the deeper Shawn sank into self-destructive habits. With no one to check him, no one to remind him, he slid further into the loop of pills, alcohol, and sleepless nights. Depression didn't hit Shawn like a sudden collapse, but like a fog thickening over time. He still smiled for the cameras, still arrogant in the ring, but inside was an emptiness that chilled to the bone. There were mornings Shawn woke up and felt nothing. No joy, no motivation, just an indefinite void. He started hating himself, hating the person he saw in the mirror, hating having to keep playing the carefree role while inside he was drained. Every time he stepped out, it felt like betraying himself, but he also knew that if he didn't, everything would collapse. Shawn didn't trust anyone enough to open up, because he believed everyone could leave when he no longer had value. But more dangerous was that he gradually stopped trusting himself. He doubted every decision, every emotion, every motive. Do I really love wrestling? Or am I just afraid of losing it? Do I still have talent? Or am I just protected by fame? Those questions had no answers, and Shawn chose to silence them with things that numbed him. Backstage became where Shawn lived parallel to another self, a tired, irritable, vulnerable man, but not allowed to show it. Every time someone tried to approach, he raised defenses, because closeness meant the risk of being seen for real. And Shawn didn't believe that real person deserved to stay. Unprovoked anger, unpredictable behavior, impulsive decisions gradually became signs of an overloaded mind. But in the WWE world back then, everything was justified by results. As long as Shawn Michaels still sold tickets, still created moments no one else could, every issue was pushed aside. And that very silence made the backstage hell deeper. No one stopped him, and Shawn didn't know how to stop himself. He began feeling like he was living outside his body, watching himself go through events, matches, interviews like a stranger. Each day that passed, the distance between the character and the real person grew wider. HBK grew bigger, while Shawn shrank smaller. There were rare moments when Shawn sat alone in the locker room after a match, hand wraps loosening, sweat drying on his skin. He looked down at the floor and wondered how far he'd gone. But then, that thought was quickly extinguished by the pain, by the call of pills, by the urge to keep going, because stopping meant facing it, and facing it was something Shawn wasn't ready for. The self-hatred grew, not because he was failing, but because he felt he was living a life that wasn't his. He hated having to pretend strength, hated having to act carefree, hated having to keep the image perfect, while inside he was shattered. But he also hated the thought that without that image, he'd have nothing left. And so Shawn Michaels kept walking through his own backstage hell, where painkillers and alcohol replaced connection, where isolation was chosen as self-defense, and where trust in others, then trust in himself, was gradually worn away. This wasn't the phase of a loud fall from grace, but the quiet rotting of a person trapped between the legend the world needed and the real man he no longer dared look straight at. Montreal was not just a place in Shawn Michaels' career. It became a permanent scar, a moment when the whole world seemed to turn its back on him at once. And from then on, the story of Shawn Michaels was never viewed with neutral eyes again. The Montreal Screwjob wasn't a place to judge right or wrong. It wasn't a court, and Shawn Michaels wasn't given a chance to stand in a fair trial. What was more important, and crueler, was that from that moment, he was forever framed in a role he couldn't control, the villain of history. That night passed quickly in the ring, but its aftershocks lasted decades in Shawn's mind. When the bell rang, when everything ended in chaos, he didn't just lose a professional relationship, he lost the right to be understood. The public didn't see a man who was exhausted, lost, caught up in decisions beyond his control. They only saw a symbol to vent anger on, a convenient face to label as betrayal, and Shawn Michaels became that name. No need to listen, no need for context, no need for depth. From that second, every story about Shawn started with Montreal and ended with Montreal. In the locker rooms, backstage, in WWE's long hallways, Shawn clearly felt the change. Avoiding eyes, prolonged silences when he entered, whispers stopping mid-sentence. The isolation, already there before, now became visible and heavier than ever. He was no longer the hard-to-approach colleague. He became the suspected one. And suspicion, in a world full of competition and egos, was a sentence without needing declaration. Shawn didn't try to explain, partly because he knew any words then would be meaningless, partly because he was too tired to defend himself. But that silence was taken as admission. Every time Shawn stepped out after Montreal, the cheers were no longer pure. In them was anger, contempt, even joy in seeing him hated. Shawn Michaels became the character audiences loved to hate more than loved to understand, and he felt it clearer than anyone. There were nights, standing backstage, hearing the crowd's reaction, Shawn knew he could no longer return to his old image. He was framed, imprisoned in a role this time not scripted, but imposed by collective memory. The scariest part wasn't being hated, but being hated to the point no one cared about the real person behind it. The Montreal Screwjob erased all nuance in how the world saw Shawn Michaels. He was no longer allowed to be complex. He was only allowed to be the villain. In that context, the depression and self-hatred Shawn had carried before grew deeper. He started believing he maybe deserved it all. If the whole world said he was the bad guy, then maybe his real self wasn't worth protecting either. The fragile confidence left was quickly worn away. Shawn didn't just lose trust in others. He lost trust that he could be forgiven. Every time he looked back at Montreal, he didn't see a career decision, but a door closing. The door to empathy, the door to being seen as a struggling human. And when those doors closed, Shawn Michaels felt he had no escape. He couldn't go back to the old self, because that image had been torn apart. He also couldn't fully accept the villain role, because deep down, he knew he wasn't just that. But the world didn't care about that contradiction. Montreal became the excuse to simplify Shawn Michaels into an easy story to tell. And that very simplification was the cruelest part. In the months and years after, Shawn lived surrounded by the memory. Every interview, every question, every look pulled him back to that moment. No release, no new page. The Montreal Screwjob became the longest shadow in Shawn Michaels' life, covering every effort, every achievement, every moment he tried to move forward. He wasn't allowed further mistakes, because the first one was etched so deep it couldn't be erased. And in that isolation, Shawn Michaels gradually withdrew completely. He trusted less, spoke less, and relied more on things that helped him forget the feeling of being hated. Pills, alcohol, emotional numbness, all became easier to reach when he believed no one was on his side anymore. Montreal didn't kill Shawn Michaels' career immediately, but it killed the illusion that he was still unconditionally loved. It forced him to live with the feeling that no matter what he did, part of the world would always see him through the lens of betrayal. And for a man who'd carried fear of abandonment since childhood, being framed as the most hated was the fatal blow. Shawn Michaels walked out of Montreal not as winner or loser, but as a man trapped in a role he couldn't escape, couldn't fix, and didn't know how to keep living, except by accepting that the whole world had chosen to turn its back on him. After Montreal, Shawn Michaels still stepped into the ring, as if nothing had truly ended. But 1998 brought an event no role could hide. It wasn't the crowd's boos, not the cold backstage looks, but betrayal from his own body. A serious back injury, built up from countless falls, wrong landings, and years of recklessness, finally forced Shawn to stop. At first, he tried to see it as temporary, pain that would pass like others. But this time, no. The pain didn't go away. It stayed, deep and persistent, creeping into every smallest movement, every breath. Doctors spoke cautiously, but the message was clear. Continuing to wrestle carried real risk of paralysis. For Shawn Michaels, it wasn't just a medical diagnosis. It was a suspended sentence over his entire being. For the first time in his life, Shawn had no choice. He couldn't step out, couldn't play HBK, couldn't do the one thing that made him feel he existed. And when the stage vanished, his identity dissolved with it. Shawn Michaels had tied his entire worth to being seen, called by name, standing under the lights. Wrestling wasn't just a job. It was his refuge from fear of abandonment, his way to control the world. Now, with his body not allowing continuation, Shawn faced the biggest void of his life. He didn't know who he was, if not Shawn Michaels in the ring. Long days without training, performing, without entrance music, made him feel erased from his own life. The depression already smoldering before now flared more intensely. With no stage to escape to, Shawn was forced to face the real person behind the character, a confrontation he was never ready for. Helplessness gnawed day by day. He saw events happen without him, heard cheers for others, and fear of replacement became reality. Shawn had believed he was irreplaceable, that the lights needed him. But lying in a hospital bed, unable to bend without pain, the world kept turning. Stories kept being told. Stories kept being told. And Shawn Michaels, for the first time, was no longer at the center. That struck his deepest fear, the one following him from rootless childhood, that one day people would leave and no longer need him. The injury didn't just take his ability to wrestle. It took the control Shawn had clung to for years. He couldn't decide when to return, couldn't push his body like before, couldn't will his way through. Every wrong move reminded him this body no longer obeyed. And when the body betrayed, the soul wavered too. Shawn started hating himself for weakness he couldn't accept. He hated relying on others, waiting, admitting he was no longer invincible. HBK's arrogance had no place in this reality. Instead, was a man trapped with pain, both physical and mental. Unable to wrestle, Shawn lost the only structure keeping him balanced. Days without wrestling became meaningless. He woke with no goal, no place to channel energy, no way to prove worth. Dark thoughts returned, heavier because he had no familiar escape. Painkillers were still there, but now not to stand strong, just to pull him into prolonged numbness. Alcohol was no longer to sleep, but to escape the reality that his career might be over. Shawn Michaels had lived for the lights, and when the lights went out, he was like an actor left on an empty stage. No role, no audience, just silence. And the unanswered question, if I can't wrestle anymore, who am I? The 1998 injury forced Shawn to face what he'd avoided his whole life, his real self, without character, without titles, without cheers. And that self was cracking. He felt he'd lived too long for the stage and forgotten how to live for himself. Each passing day was a small battle, not against ring opponents, but against the thought that everything might be over. Shawn Michaels feared meaninglessness more than physical pain. And when the stage disappeared, that fear became clearer than ever. This was no longer the phase of arrogance or carelessness, but the moment Shawn stood at the deepest abyss of his life, where body betrayed soul, and where he was forced to learn to exist without the thing that had defined him for decades. The next 4 years passed like a prolonged void that Shawn Michaels never wanted to mark with specific timelines. It wasn't a period of rest, nor ordinary healing. It was 4 years of disappearance, where he existed on the sidelines of his own life, without a stage, without a role, without a clear reason to wake up each morning. Depression didn't strike like a fierce storm, but clung like thick fog, making everything blurred, tasteless, and heavy. Shawn Michaels woke up feeling exhausted despite doing nothing, sat for hours in silence, letting time pass without leaving a trace. He no longer escaped through wrestling, nor had the strength to pretend carelessness. Everything that once defined him had been taken away, and the real person behind HBK emerged in his most stripped state. Shawn began isolating himself, not because he hated the world, but because he didn't know how to face it without his familiar mask. Calls grew fewer, relationships faded, and he accepted it as necessary punishment. In that silence, Shawn was forced to confront questions he had always silenced with entrance music and dazzling lights. What had he lived for, and what was left now that it was gone? Memories of Montreal, of mistakes, of arrogance and burned bridges returned one by one, no longer shielded by alcohol or physical pain. Shawn began hating himself in a quiet way, not explosive, but persistent. He hated the person he'd become, hated letting himself slide this far, and hated the helplessness of not knowing where to start fixing it. There were days he didn't leave the house, didn't talk to anyone, just letting time pass like a trial. Survival became the only goal, not living. In those 4 years, no miracle happened. No sudden awakening, no immediate comeback. Just very long days and very heavy nights. But in that bareness, Shawn began touching something he'd always avoided: faith. Not as a promise of victory, but as a thin rope to cling to when everything else had snapped. Faith didn't come to erase depression or make pain vanish. It just came with a simple whisper: try one more day. Shawn didn't become strong immediately. He still doubted, still collapsed, still had mornings he didn't want to leave bed, but faith gave him a different breath, a different view of weakness. For the first time, Shawn allowed himself to admit he couldn't control everything, that some things were beyond him. And in that admission, the pressure to always be invincible gradually eased. Shawn Michaels didn't find life's meaning in those 4 years of disappearance. He only learned to endure it. Each day without falling became a small victory. No applause, no cheers. Some days he only managed one thing: not returning to old habits. And for him, that was enough. Those 4 years taught Shawn that existence doesn't always need glamour or grand goals. Sometimes, existence is just staying, not giving up, even without knowing what tomorrow holds. He gradually learned to accept the past without tearing himself apart over it, to see mistakes as parts of being human, not proof of worthlessness. Depression didn't vanish completely, but it no longer swallowed him like before. Isolation gradually gave way to small, cautious, slow connections. Shawn no longer sought salvation in the lights, but in very ordinary moments where he didn't need to perform. When those 4 years ended, Shawn Michaels didn't become a perfect new person. He just became a person still alive, still standing, still strong enough to try stepping forward. And sometimes, for someone who'd stood at such a deep abyss, one more day without falling was the greatest miracle life could grant. In 2002, Shawn Michaels returned, not as a loud declaration, not as a conqueror coming back to reclaim the throne, but as a man carrying cracks that never fully healed, stepping into the ring with the caution of someone who'd lost everything once. When the music played, the crowd still cheered, but the feeling was entirely different this time. Shawn Michaels no longer walked with the careless arrogance of old HBK. He stood there, quieter, slower, as if weighing every breath. His body was no longer an absolute weapon. His back still hurt. Memories of the injury lingered, reminding him every fall could be the last. But that very fragility made the return moment heartbreakingly real. Shawn didn't come back to prove he was invincible. He came back because he'd finally accepted he could be vulnerable and still deserved to stand in the ring. Humility showed in how he looked at opponents, listened to his body, chose his moments. No longer rushing to conquer, Shawn began wrestling to tell stories. Each match became a wordless confession about past mistakes, sleepless nights, 4 years of disappearance where he learned to survive. In the ring, Shawn didn't hide his limits. He acknowledged them with slower pacing, intense focus on every move, choosing safety over showmanship, and that made his matches carry unusual weight. Every strike wasn't just technique, but consideration between passion and responsibility to himself. Fans began seeing a new Shawn Michaels, no longer needing to prove he was the center, but still touching hearts with raw honesty. When he fell, people worried for real. When he rose, applause wasn't just for skill, but for courage. Shawn knew he couldn't return to the old self, and he didn't want to. This return didn't erase the past. It brought the past into the ring with him. Every scar became part of the story. Every limit, a reminder this career was no longer escape, but dialogue with himself. There were moments, mid-match, Shawn paused a beat, breathed deep, as if whispering, "I'm still here, and that's enough." That vulnerability didn't weaken him. It made him more human. Colleagues saw Shawn who listened, apologized, yielded when needed. Fans saw a legend no longer distant at the peak, but with them, in fear, in hope, in trying not to fall. The 2002 return wasn't a miraculous rebirth. It was a cautious step by someone who understood glory, was no longer the only destination. Each Shawn Michaels match from then carried the shape of a prolonged confession. I was wrong. I fell. I disappeared. But I learned to return without lying to myself anymore. And in that truth, the stage lights found him again, not as dazzling as before, but warmer and more enduring, like a flame shielded from wind, enough to light the remaining steps. In the years after 2002, Shawn Michaels entered WrestleMania no longer as a conqueror, but as a pilgrim, carrying memories, mistakes, and gratitude. The name Mr. WrestleMania was still announced, but the tone was different. No longer the arrogance of someone believing he was the universe's center, just the quiet focus of a man knowing each time here was a gift. Shawn Michaels no longer rushed out to challenge the world. He stepped out to dialogue with the past. Each match now was a wordless repentance, a way to atone through complete devotion, self-discipline, absolute respect for opponents and fans. Shawn fought not to win at any cost, but to deserve being there. In the ring, he no longer sought reckless, showy spots. He chose pacing, moments, ways to tell stories. So fans felt the sincerity. Familiar moves suddenly carried different weight, not from higher skill, but because behind them was a man once lost, trying to do right. When Shawn fell, it was no longer dramatic setup. It was reminder his body once betrayed him, each rise a small win over fear. When he stood, eyes no longer cold sharp, but sparkling gratitude for still having strength. Each WrestleMania became a chapter in a long self-narrative. I was once wrong, I hurt others, but today, I'm here to do better. Post-match handshakes, respectful nods, silent seconds between beats that was Shawn's new language. He apologized by protecting opponents, putting safety before ego, yielding to bigger stories than himself. No carelessness, no provocation, just solemn respect. Fans felt it. Applause rang not just for explosions, but because they saw a man who'd learned to bow before his own journey. Shawn no longer chased titles. He chased integrity, and that integrity made his final WrestleManias sacred. Not a stage to flaunt glory, but an altar where he laid down old burdens bit by bit. When the bell ended, Shawn didn't rush to celebrate. He breathed deep, looked around, as if memorizing every face, every cheer not to own, but to thank. The final Mr. WrestleMania was no longer proud title. It was reminder this man had gone far to return to humility. Fighting as repentance didn't shrink Shawn, it made him great, more quietly. And in that quiet, his legacy endured. Not for victories, but for learning to apologize to the world through actions, thank through devotion, and leave the stage with lighter heart than when he returned. When the final WrestleMania bell closed and Shawn Michaels left the lights, his life didn't turn to another loud chapter. It settled down. In Texas, nights grew longer, quieter, truer than any moment he'd lived in the ring. Shawn Michaels no longer woke to flight schedules, no longer heard entrance music in his ears. Instead came silent evenings, a home where soft yellow lights reflected on old photos, where time didn't push him to be anyone but himself. Family became the center of this new rhythm, not as career reward, but as anchor he'd missed too many years. Simple dinners, conversations without performance, moments sitting still, hearing wind on the porch, all gave Shawn safety he'd never had chasing fame. But quiet didn't mean forgetting. In Texas, silence, memories came easier. Long nights, when everyone slept, Shawn sat alone, letting the past flow like an unrewindable film. Montreal, the 1998 injury, 4 years disappeared. Mistakes made, unspoken apologies. Those memories didn't vanish, and he no longer chased them away. He learned to live with them, like scars, not flaunting, not denying. Besides family, NXT became Shawn's only link to wrestling, but his role changed. No longer needing lights to exist, Shawn stood behind, quietly guiding, listening, reminding the young about this career's real price. He didn't preach. He shared his story with humility. Training sessions, advice, silent observations. That was how Shawn gave back to the sport that saved and hurt him. He taught discipline, body respect, and most importantly, not letting identity be swallowed by the stage. Some nights, leaving NXT, Shawn drove home in Texas, dark radio off, just tire sounds rolling steady. In those moments, memories returned not fierce, but persistent. He remembered tens of thousands chanting his name, but no longer craved it. Instead, quiet gratitude for leaving, while clear-headed enough to know what he needed. Retirement wasn't paradise, nor complete atonement. It was life-learning balance between peaceful present and unerasable past. Shawn Michaels lived, knowing long nights always exist, nights memories knock, nights wondering if he'd done enough to right wrongs. But unlike before, he didn't run. He stayed with those feelings, allowed weakness, and woke next morning to live an ordinary day. In Texas, That man was no longer Mr. WrestleMania. He was a husband, father, teacher, and a human who'd gone deep enough into the abyss to know quiet is victory too. Memories never vanish, but they no longer control him. They exist as gentle reminders this journey had its price, and that still standing, still grateful, still knowing to live slow through long nights, is how Shawn Michaels keeps winning, quietly but enduringly, beyond the stage lights. Finally, when all the cheers have faded into the distance, when every title is just a memory recounted in a deeper voice, the story of Shawn Michaels must be viewed from a different point, not from the peaks, but from the silence behind them. The double life often spoken of with Shawn Michaels wasn't a meticulously staged deception, nor a two-faced game to manipulate the world. It was survival. The way a rootless child learned to exist by creating a strong enough persona not to be abandoned. The way a man drained by fame learned to hide fear, to keep standing before tens of thousands of eyes. HBK wasn't born to deceive anyone. HBK was born to protect Shawn from the very cracks that childhood, pressure, and loneliness had carved deep. For 30 years, those two people coexisted not because Shawn wanted to live falsely, but because he'd never been taught how to live truly while still feeling safe. When the world only rewards the strong, Shawn had to appear invincible. When mistakes aren't forgiven, he had to hide weakness. It wasn't a moral choice, but a survival reflex of a person pushed too high too soon. And that's why Shawn Michaels' life isn't the story of a legend who fell and was redeemed by miracle. It's the story of a human peeling through layers of shells, layers of self-deception, to finally learn to stay with himself without needing the stage for cover. Shawn Michaels' legacy, therefore, doesn't lie in perfection. It lies in the late but enduring honesty. He doesn't hide that he was arrogant, hurt others, addicted, self-hating, escaping in lights and pills. But he also doesn't let those things become his whole self. He chooses to keep living, slower, clearer-headed, more responsible for what he leaves behind. His final matches weren't to prove he was still the best, but to say sorry to the business, to the fans, to the body that endured too long. In retirement, Shawn Michaels doesn't try to rewrite history prettier. He accepts that history with all its scratches. He lives in Texas, in long nights without music, where memories still knock but no longer control. He's with family, at NXT, in moments no one films, no one scores. And there, the double life ends. Not because Shawn became perfect, but because he no longer needs a role to exist. The final image of this life isn't Shawn Michaels raising his arms in a sea of people, but a man sitting still, breathing steady, accepting both the light and shadows that made him. A human who understands redemption isn't erasing the past, but living the remaining life without betraying truth anymore. Shawn Michaels is no longer HBK, no longer Mr. WrestleMania. He's just Shawn, living slow, living true, brave enough to stay with himself. And perhaps that's the hardest victory, and the most complete one, of an entire double life. The story of Shawn Michaels leaves a very American ache. The ache of a person raised on achievement, measured by cheers, and nearly crushed by his own success. The greatest sorrow isn't in the ring falls, but in Shawn having to live decades in a double life, where arrogant, carefree HBK existed to shield an insecure, depressed, self-hating Shawn. Details like the 1998 back injury that nearly paralyzed him, 4 years disappeared just to survive, not live, or relying on painkillers and alcohol to get through nights, show the real price of glory never televised. The Montreal Screwjob didn't just frame him as the hated one. It deepened the fear of abandonment formed from a rootless childhood. But what makes this story worthy of honor is how Shawn returned in 2002. More vulnerable, more humble, treating each match like a confession. He didn't try to erase the past, but brought it into the ring, turning final WrestleManias into journeys of atonement. where gratitude replaced inflated ego. The lesson for Americans is clear. Success can't be the only refuge for identity. When job, fame, or social role vanish, a person must still have themselves left. True strength isn't always winning, but admitting weakness, stopping, and living the rest honestly. Shawn Michaels shows redemption isn't grand words, but ordinary days lived slow, true, without performing anymore. If the story of Shawn Michaels touched you about a man who once lived two lives and bravely learned to live true, please subscribe to keep joining journeys of other flawed but worthy lives. Thank you for listening to the end, and see you in the next video, where we continue telling stories not just of legends, but of the humans behind the lights.